Hi everybody. I hope you're enjoying the class so far. This week we're going to go to that other end of the operant conditioning paradigm and talk about antecedents. I'll let you know up front that I think this lecture is going to be a little long. But antecedents and antecedent control and all of the different ways we talk about antecedents are a bit more complex and aren't talked about as much as reinforcement and punishment. And what I find is sometimes it can get really confusing when talking about different types of antecedent control. So what this lecture is going to do is really break down the different types of control, give a lot of examples, use the paradigms that we've been using, and make sure that the distinctions between the different types of antecedents and how they affect behavior is pretty clear. Which then you'll be able to get into more advanced topics. So I just wanted to kind of give that caveat, that heads up, to let you know ahead of time, and let's get started. Also, one other thing that I just want to let you know and kind of give you a heads up is I'm not feeling too well. I'm going to do the best I can to keep my voice nice and clear and avoid sniffling and that type of thing into the microphone. But I did want to let you know just because I know it can be kind of annoying. So I'm going to apologize ahead of time. All right, now let's get started. So we've talked about the operant conditioning paradigm, which at its basic form, the most basic form, is going to be that ABC that we talk about. Last week we spent a lot of time talking about reinforcers and punishers, but what about that A? Sometimes we don't spend as much time, like I had said before, talking about it, so that's what we're going to really look at, all of the different things that can encompass A, or antecedents. So basically what we're going to talk about today is a number of different areas. One, we're going to talk about discriminative stimuli because that's what will fill that typical A spot in a three-term contingency or the simplest defined operant. However, we will also talk about motivating operations because MOs are antecedent events that also affect behavior. And lastly, we're going to talk about conditional stimuli and increasing those three-term contingencies to more complex defined operants. What I hope you'll see is by adding these variables, motivating operations and conditional stimuli, into the analysis and into the science, it makes our science able to more completely describe behavior. And that's what's really exciting. I know many of you have gotten to that point that you just can't make the three-term contingency make sense. And a lot of times what's missing then is some conditional control or effects of motivating operations. So let's see. When talking about antecedents, we're typically talking about two different areas. One is the area of stimulus control, and the other is the area of motivating operations. We'll talk about each today, and we're going to break them up like this. So when we're talking about stimulus control, we're talking about some type of discrimination, and it's either going to be simple discrimination or conditional discriminations. Motivating operations, on the other hand, have a couple different areas. We're going to talk about abolishing and establishing operations, but we're also going to look at the effects of condition motivating operations, the CMOS, CMOR, and CMOT. These can be pretty difficult to understand, so I'm hoping by giving a lot of exposure to them today that all of these areas, honestly, will be areas that you'll include in your analysis pretty readily. So let's get started with stimulus control. Stimulus control is one of those principles of behavior that I talked about in an earlier lecture, included that all behavior analysts will include stimulus control, reinforcement, punishment, extinction as basic principles of behavior. Stimulus control, I believe, is the one that's least talked about. And Sidman also refers to it as the one that's kind of the least understood. We do a lot with reinforcement and punishment and extinction, and stimulus control can sometimes be forgotten. However, when you think about it and we really get involved, is stimulus control is involved in all behavioral processes. So understanding it can really kind of make everything else come to life. There's some terms you should already know by now. Whoops. That animation evidently wasn't set. So one of those terms is discriminative stimulus. Another one of those terms is stimulus control itself. And lastly, discrimination. These are definitions you should already have in your repertoire going all the way back to behavior assessment. One thing that I want to note is that these terms are not synonymous. They're not synonyms. So even though they talk about the same types of scenarios, they're different parts of the same scenario. So thinking about it, stimulus control is the principle of behavior. Just like reinforcement is the principal behavior or punishment is the principal behavior, so it describes the entire situation. Discrimination is going to be the process by which stimulus control is acquired, but you probably need more information on that, so I'd look into it. And discriminative stimulus is going to be that stimulus that evokes behavior. So making sure you talk about those not interchangeably can really help you engage in behavior analytic analysis. To add that would like extend, that would move further, and I would really encourage you starting to pay attention to these terms, and then we'll add even more today. When we talk about stimulus control, the simplest form is going to be a simple discrimination. And this is, like I said, that typical three-term contingency that we've seen in the past. The defined operant simply is a part of where one stimulus evokes a response that has been followed by reinforcement in the past. When we talk about discrimination, we're talking about something really specific, and it's important to understand the entire process. So here we have where an SD, or discriminative stimulus, evokes a behavior because in the past, when that behavior occurred in the presence of that stimulus, reinforcement followed. It's really, really important to talk about it like this. An incorrect way to talk about it would be someone behaves in the presence of a stimulus because they know reinforcement is coming or because they want the reinforcer. Stimulus control is acquired because of the past history of behavior in the presence of that stimulus and reinforcement following it. When we're talking about discrimination training or how discrimination occurs, it's also very important to consider what happens when the behavior occurs in the presence of a stimulus that is not the SD. So when we talk about S deltas, we're talking about stimuli that are not the SD. So another way to say S delta is not SD. In thinking about this, if you are looking at discrimination training and there is a green card and a red card in front of a student, and every time they touch the green card, reinforcement occurs, and every time they touch the red card, reinforcement does not occur. The S delta condition is not red card, it's not green. So if they touch the table, reinforcement will not occur. If they touch their face, reinforcement will not occur. If that SD, which I believe it was the green card, is the only stimulus that will evoke the response and result in reinforcement. So that's what you really want to be thinking about whenever you're thinking about discrimination and discrimination training. Both of these processes need to occur in order for discrimination to occur, in order to get a situation where the stimulus will actually become an SD and reliably evoke behavior because of the past conditioning. So let's talk through a couple examples of simple discrimination. One, simple discrimination occurs in certain forms of conversation. So if I ask you what your name is, my guess is that because of most of our histories of reinforcement, you will say a certain name. For instance, I would say Nicole, because in the past that has been followed by reinforcement. The only stimulus that evokes the behavior of, say, Nicole is, what's your name? There's no other additional stimuli, just what's your name, Nicole, reinforcement. Another simple example that we've kind of talked about in past is the light switch example. So in a situation where a room is dark, a light switch will evoke pushing up behavior because in the past it's been followed by light. There's no other stimulus. We'll talk about some potential, but in terms of the stimuli, just the light switch evokes the pushing up behavior. If the light switch wasn't there, we would not engage in pushing up behavior because in the past, if we did that, reinforcement would not occur. So let's look at the paradigm. Light switch evokes pushing up. In the past, been followed by light. No light switch, push up, no light. So why would you engage in that behavior in the future? No history of reinforcement. Really clear. And it's a really good example of how a stimulus acquires control of a behavior. This is a very, very clean example and should really kind of make it clear how we do our analysis and how stimulus control is involved. Just the light switch evokes the pushing up because of the light. No light switch. It would really be kind of weird to engage in a moving your hand up behavior if there was no light switch. And it's not because we know there's no light switch, or we know it's silly, we know it's ridiculous. It's just that the light switch has gained complete discriminative control over the behavior. So now we get a little more complex. Conditional discriminations are going to be situations where that three-term defined operant will come under the control of one or more stimuli. So typically here we're talking about a 4 or more term contingency. And this is how a lot of our behavior occurs. The discrimination process is the same for conditioned stimuli, but it's just kind of turning that three-term contingency on and off. So let's look at the operant. So we have that situation where the behavior and consequence, and it occurs in the presence of a discriminative stimulus. This three-term contingency will always stay intact. So when determining what stimuli are SDs, it's important to note that that SD behavior reinforcement could occur at all times. It's its own little operant. However, that whole operant comes under the control of a conditional stimulus. So basically, that conditional stimulus turns on the SD so it evokes behavior. Behavior will occur in the presence of the discriminative stimulus, and then reinforcement will occur because there's a past history of reinforcement. However, if that conditional stimulus is not present, most likely the SD is not going to evoke behavior. And what that comes down to is really the history of reinforcement. So let's look at an example. In a situation where I say, go get the water bottle, or find the water bottle, right? What do we have? So my guess is that you'll start walking towards and going to pick up the water bottle, because in the past that's been followed by a thanks or a smile or something like that. Of course, if we were face to face. So we have a multi-term contingency. Thinking about it, what we need to do is determine all of the different variables. So we have the situation where the behavior would be picking up the water bottle and or picking up, moving your muscles up, and the reinforcement, let's say it's me saying thanks. However, what we need to figure out is what's that defined operant? What is the stimulus that will evoke picking up behavior, and what stimulus will come to turn that three-term contingency on? So right now, first we need to determine what are the two stimuli. So take a second and think about it. What are the two stimuli that are involved in this behavior, or in this defined operant? And I'm hoping you came up with the statement or the vocal behavior of myself, the vocal stimulus, the auditory stimulus being, can you get the water bottle, or exactly what I said, and then the other one being the water bottle. So what question I want you to ask is, which one could be a three-term contingency that stands alone? So could me saying, can you get the water bottle, evoke picking up behavior? No. The three-term contingency is water bottle, pick up, me saying thanks. However, you most likely will not pick up the water bottle because of its past history of my gratitude unless I ask you to pick up the water bottle. Because in the past, picking up the water bottle, if I had not asked for it, would not result in my gratitude. However, when I ask for it, the water bottle would evoke picking up because of the past history of gratitude. I know this can be a little complex, so let's think about another one. So I've taught my cat to man for food by sitting by his bowl. When he sits by his bowl, and there are some other parameters, but breaking it down pretty easily, when he sits by his bowl, that will result in me dropping food in his bowl. So thinking about his behavior would be one paradigm, but let's think about my behavior, right, of food dropping in bowl. And the reinforcement could be a bunch of different things. The cat eating, the negative reinforcement of the cat no longer staring at me sitting by his bowl. There could be a bunch of different things, but we'll say it's the cat eating. So what we want to think about is we have the situation of dropping the food and the cat eating. What are the two stimuli that could that are involved in this example? And I hope you came up with the cat and the bowl. So which one is the SD? Which one can stand alone in the defined operant that we have here and evoke dropping in behavior? Again, I hope you came up with the bowl. Just the cat sitting would really make a mess if it evoked dropping food. So we have this three-term contingency: bowl, drop food in, cat's eating. However, that comes under the total control of the cat sitting by the bowl. Because in the past, if the cat is not sitting by the bowl, it would not necessarily result in the cat eating. That reinforcement would not have occurred in those contingencies. So now we're in for lecture check-in number 1. We've gone through a lot of information. So let's talk about something that might be a little bit of an applied example for you. And it has to do with determining which variables are which in a conditional discrimination. So when teaching listener responding, so those are those programs that involve the student engaging in some type of nonverbal behavior in reaction to your verbal behavior. So for this case, we're talking about a receptive ID program where you say the name of something and they touch the picture of it. So in this type of program, what is the SD? Okay, and I hope everybody's thinking a lot about that defined operant that can stand alone and came up with the picture. So thinking about our four-term contingency, a picture can evoke touching behavior and be and contact reinforcement, although it wasn't defined. However, it only does that when you say something like touch the elephant. A way I talk about this with people, because it can be really difficult, is if right now I said touch the elephant, my guess is many of you would not be able to engage in behavior that would contact reinforcement. However, once in a while, I have said it, and people have a stuffed animal sitting next to them that happens to be an elephant. And they could. So at that point, you know that touch the elephant is not part of the standalone defined three-term contingency, and that you need an SD, such as a picture of an elephant, a stuffed animal elephant, an actual elephant, in order for that to be an operant or a behavior that would contact reinforcement. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about motivating operations, or if I'm honest, a lot about motivating operations. We're going to talk from the beginning and really just make sure that your understanding of motivating operations is really clean before we get into some of the more complex elements. So when we talk about motivating operations, we're talking about any event that temporarily alters the effectiveness or value of a reinforcer or punisher, and therefore alters the behaviors that have been followed by that consequence in the past. So you'll notice that I got really loud when I said or punisher. That's a common mistake that motivating operations are just talked about in reference to reinforcers. So it's very important to remember all the consequences. So I want to break down the thought there, that with the three-term contingency, see, we will always, with motivating operations, still have a defined operant of an SD, behavior, and consequence. However, that MO is going to alter the value of the reinforcer in the defined operant, and therefore alter the probability that behavior will occur in the future. So notice that the MO and SD are connected because of the effect that they together will have on behavior. So we're talking about the two effects of MOs. There's a value altering, and that's when we're talking about the effect on the reinforcer or punisher, the effect on the consequence. And then there's the behavior altering. Thinking about it, how would we even know if there's a value altering effect? A behavior has got to change. So if you don't talk about both the value and behavior altering effects of MOs, you're really not being concise, and you're really not being thorough in terms of your analysis. So at all times, value altering, behavior altering. So when we talk about value altering, we're talking about two possible effects: establishing effect and abolishing effect. An establishing effect will increase the effectiveness of that consequence, meaning making that consequence more potent, more effective. And notice I'm saying consequence, not reinforcer. Abolishing operations then will decrease that effectiveness. When we talk about behavior altering, we're talking about some words that you might hear: the evocative effect or the abative effect. And when we're talking about evocative effect, we'll talk about the increased probability of behaviors occurring that have been followed by that consequence, and abative will look at the decrease of such behaviors. These are words that you might hear. I'm not going to use them much today, evocative and abative, but they're terms that you should be familiar with. At this point, we'll talk more about increases and decreases. So, kind of giving you an idea of how MOs are classified, I wanted to give you this chart. So all events that have these effects are going to be considered motivating operations, or MOs. If you read articles prior to 2003, they would be called establishing operations. But 2003, and we are well after 2003, so we're going to talk about them as motivating operations. The motivating operations either are establishing operations or abolishing operations. And then each of those types of MOs will have a value altering effect. So they will either be an EO of a reinforcer or EO of a punisher, or AO of a reinforcer or AO of a punisher. So you see how we're getting more and more complex, and that you need to make sure to tact each of the types of when you're talking about MOs. So this is a version of a table that I'm sure you've seen Cooper, and it's kind of been all over the place. But what it displays is the direction of the altering of each of the effects of MOs. So in the column to the left, we're talking about reinforcers and punishers, and that will be cross-referenced to EO or AO. So the block that says increase, increase would be in reference to an EO of a reinforcer. And what the increases and decreases are talking about is the top one is talking about the value altering effect. So the effect it has on the consequence, and the directionality of the behavior altering effect is on the bottom. So for instance, the increase, both the value of the consequence and the behavior of the consequence would increase for an EO of a reinforcer. And we're going to use this more, but I just wanted to introduce it there. So for lecture check-in number 2, what I'd like you to do is, when talking about the general effects of all variables that alter the effectiveness of a consequence, what term should you use? And my hope, everybody said B. So we know that EOs and AOs are just types of MOs and wouldn't be able to fully describe all of the variables that alter the effectiveness of consequence. But what about SD? So when we're talking about the difference between an SD and an MO, the question you want to ask yourself is the event changing the value of a consequence or the effectiveness of a consequence, or is it changing the probability that that behavior will occur because of the past history of reinforcement? So SDs will be signals of the availability of a consequence, while MOs will be signals of the value of a consequence. Thinking about a situation where I am walking through a desert and there is nothing around me, and I've been doing it for a couple of days, the guess is that water would be pretty valuable at that time. However, I'm not engaging in manding for water or pushing a water fountain button or anything like that, because there are no discriminative stimuli signaling the availability of reinforcement is there. In an opposite situation, where I just drank a whole water bottle full of water and walk by a water fountain, the water as a reinforcer is available, however not valuable. So those are the questions you want to ask yourself, the difference between MO and SD. But now we're going to talk more about MO specifically. All right, so let's talk about the first type of MO, the first value altering effect of MO. So EOs of reinforcers result in increased effectiveness of a reinforcer and therefore increase probability of behavior that have been followed by that reinforcer in the past. So you can see what I did was just change the words alter to increase in both of these both places here, and change the word consequence to reinforcer. So it makes sense that if a reinforcer is more effective, behavior is going to be more likely to occur. So let's look at an example. And of course, it's an example that I already used in differentiating between water and SDs. But we have the situation where it's really hot and I haven't had water for a long time. So when we define deprivation, that's how you want to talk about it, is the extent of, or the duration, or the temporal extent of the time between water ingestion and now. So haven't had water for a long time. So the first question you always ask yourself is, what will be more effective? Or what will be more valuable? And in this case, water would be very valuable. And what types of consequence would this be? It'd probably be more valuable as a reinforcer. Therefore, water responses that have been followed by water in the past, like I said before, demanding for water, walking to a vending machine, walking into a convenience store, all of those things may be more likely to occur. And so it increases the value of water and increases the probability of behaviors that have been followed by water in the past. Moving on to an AO, abolishing operation of a reinforcer. Now, abolishing operations we know decrease the value of an event as a certain consequence, in this case, a reinforcer. So therefore, if a reinforcer is less valuable at that moment, behaviors that have been followed by that reinforcer are more likely to decrease or less likely to happen. And you see we did the same thing in the definition here, that they temporarily decrease the value of a reinforcer and therefore decrease behaviors that have been followed by that reinforcer in the past. So let's talk about an example here. Here we're going to talk about the opposite effect of satiation. So just like deprivation, you're talking about the time since something happened. So satiation, I just ate Thanksgiving dinner. Very full. So that is the event and all of the stimuli related to that. So what will be more valuable in these questions? Obviously, that's not asked in the right way. So nothing will be more valuable. It's an abolishing operation. So thinking about things that would be less valuable. Any type of food, most likely, maybe even any type of water, but any type of food would be less valuable as a reinforcer. Therefore, behaviors that have been followed by food in the past, asking for dessert, making dessert, going into the refrigerator and pulling food out, will be less likely to happen. It's not that dessert and those snacks are no longer reinforcers. It's just right now, temporarily, they're not valuable as reinforcers, so those behaviors will not occur, are less likely to occur. Moving on to our third type of establishing operations, which can get a little more confusing because we're talking about punishers. So if we're talking about an establishing operation of a punisher is more effective. It increased the effectiveness of a punisher. And since the operation of a punisher is decreasing the behavior, that means behaviors will be more likely to decrease. Again, looking at the definition, just putting it right in there, temporarily increase the effectiveness of a punisher and therefore decrease the behaviors that have been followed by that punisher in the past. So thinking, again, it's not that the punisher is a punisher now, it's just a temporary effect. So looking at this situation, all right. So I don't know about any of you, but I've gotten sunburned many times in the past. But in a situation where you are sunburnt or you have sustained a sunburn, a number of punishers would be more effective. And to go to what could be considered an old school example is thinking about spanking, so or a smack to your hand. So in a situation where a young child following whining, let's say, would be smacked on their hand, and that in the past has decreased the likelihood of whining. In a situation where they have sunburn on their hand, that smack may be an even more effective punisher, so they would be even less likely to whine. It would decrease the whining behavior even more. And then talking about our next or our last type of motivating operations, talking about an AO of a punisher. So an AO decreases the value of that punisher, and therefore behaviors that have been punished in the past may be more likely to occur, so it may increase the rate of those behaviors, or it will. Again, same definition, just that it temporarily decreases the effectiveness of the punisher and therefore increases the likelihood that that behavior will occur in the future. So let's move on to example. If you have a situation where a student calling out in class the calling out had effectively been punished by timeout from recess. Then rain may be an abolishing operation of that punisher. Rain may make the timeout from recess less effective as a punisher, may decrease the value of timeout as a punisher, and therefore calling out in class will happen more often. So really considering each of those effects in that way and drawing out the three-term contingency or plugging the examples right into the definition can be really helpful when trying to identify which value altering effect of MOs is in effect. Then another way to classify MOs is going to be whether they're unconditioned motivating operations or conditioned motivating operations. And just like unconditioned reinforcers and conditioned reinforcers, we're looking at the effect being learned or unlearned. So unconditioned motivating operations, the effect, right, whether it's that abolishing or establishing effect, will be unlearned, while with conditioned motivating operations, the effects will be learned. So let's talk about some UMO examples, which we've talked about a lot of them so far, but let's talk about a situation where temperature may be a UMO. So in a situation where it's very cold outside, that coldness may, or your decreased body temperature, may increase the value of warmth as a reinforcer, and therefore behavior that has been followed by warmth in the past would occur, like looking for a coat or putting on a coat. Now remember, when we're talking about the difference between an MO and SD, we're talking about the difference between the value of, in this case, a reinforcer or the availability. So the MO would obviously be that decreased body temperature, because that's what would make a coat or warmth a reinforcer. The SD for looking for a coat would be the closet. The SD for putting on a coat would be the coat, because they signal the availability of that reinforcement. A really important distinction here. Another example of a CMO would be painful stimulation, maybe from a paper cut. I'm sorry, I tried to have the least gross picture possible. So thinking about pain, we're usually talking about a situation where it's a UMO for some type of negative reinforcement, meaning removal of that pain would be an effective reinforcer at that time. So in this scenario, behavior that might be more likely to occur because of painful stimulation would be maybe holding and pressing down, putting pressure to the cut, because that will momentarily result in decreased pain, effectively negatively reinforcing the pushing down on the cut, where the SD at this point would be the fingertip with the cut. An important one to remember, because this can be kind of difficult, and a lot of times people will assume that pain is the SD. However, pain does not signal the availability of pain removal as a reinforcer. There has to be some other type of stimulus that would do this. It just signals that pain removal would be a valuable reinforcer. So let's do our third lecture check-in. So it's a scenario, and I want you to read it carefully, and then I'll talk about it. So in this situation, we're talking about a scenario where it's cold, and typically what happens is when I walk into my office, I turn on a fan, because that results in decreased room temperature. So it's important when we're trying to decide which of the value altering effects we're talking about, what is the consequence? So the consequence we're talking about here is decreased room temperature as a reinforcer. So I've just I've just narrowed down the answers. So that's important to really note that. And since I've already done that, let's move on. I hope everybody picked an AO of a reinforcer. So because we knew that the past reinforcer had been decreased room temperature, that the cold served as an abolishing operation for that reinforcer, that reinforcer, decreased room temperature, is not available, or not, excuse me, not potent, not effective at this moment. So therefore, I didn't engage in behavior that had resulted in that decreased room temperature in the past. Now, if this was really similar to our example of looking for a code, and it's important that you really pay attention to the consequence. Now let's move on to CMOs. CMOs can be a really interesting and really kind of complex area. Some articles that you'll read this week involve CMOs, but I want to go over the CMOs themselves to make sure that they're kind of solid in your understanding. So when we talk about CMOs, we're talking about either a surrogate condition motivating operation, a reflexive condition motivating operation, or a transitive condition motivating operation. Here they're listed as CMOS, CMOR, CMOT. And what these refer to are the different learning processes or the different effects on behavior that the MO is going to have. So let's first talk about a surrogate condition motivating operation, or CMOS. And this is most similar to the process by which reinforcers are conditioned, where the neutral stimulus will be paired with an already conditioned motivating operation or an unconditioned MO and have the same effect on behavior that MO had. So the way we're going to look at it is that we have this situation where there's an MO that has affected the value of a reinforcer and therefore affected the behavior that had been followed by that reinforcer in the past, of course, in the presence of an SD, but that MO is paired with a neutral stimulus until that neutral stimulus becomes a CMOS and has the same value altering effect and behavior altering effect that the original MO had. So let's look at an example. And it's an example that's given frequently. I can't remember if Mark Sundberg or Vince Carbone were the first ones to talk about it with this specific example. But in a situation where you have, you're deprived of caffeine, right? Caffeine would be an effective reinforcer. So if and effective reinforcer, and then making sure that then you would engage in behavior that would result in caffeine consumption or caffeine getting access to caffeine, and in this case, maybe going to Dunkin' Donuts and asking for coffee at Dunkin' Donuts. So if that caffeine deprivation is paired with seeing the sight of the Dunkin' Donuts logo or the Dunkin' Donuts cup, then it might come to a place where the Dunkin' Donuts logo or cup could effectively establish caffeine as a reinforcer, and therefore behavior that's been followed by caffeine in the past would occur. So what we're looking at is the situation where any Dunkin' Donuts stimuli, and we can talk about the generality of this, would evoke caffeine-getting behavior. So thinking about getting caffeine at Dunkin' Donuts or getting coffee at Dunkin' Donuts, there's a number of behaviors, right? Walking into the store, waiting in line, asking the cashier for coffee, walking to the end of the counter. All of those behaviors. And each of them would have distinct SDs, right? The door would be the SD for walking into the door. The people standing in a row would be the SDs for waiting in line. The cashier would be the SD for demanding for coffee. So that's why I kept this generality, but they would result in caffeine. Caffeine would be the ultimate reinforcer. So we start off by Caffeine deprivation, not having caffeine, would make caffeine an effective reinforcer, and therefore these behaviors would be more likely to occur. A very clear UMO. But then you pair it with the site of the cup. So the site of the cup and caffeine deprivation together would result in the site of the cup establishing caffeine as an effective reinforcer temporarily, and therefore increasing behaviors that have been followed by caffeine in the past. And you think about this, and it does happen, right? You see somebody with a Dunkin' Donuts cup, and you're like, and you'll start engaging in those behaviors that'll ultimately result in the caffeine in the past if that's the conditioning process that it's occurred. Moving on to the conditioned motivating operation reflexive. It happens in situations of improving or worsening, but we're going to talk about it in terms of worsening, which is really where most of the literature is focused. And the CMOR has been pretty prevalent, let's say, in recent applied literature, and a number of different researchers are doing their analysis based on the CMOR, so it's an important one to understand. So what we're looking about is when a neutral stimulus repeatedly comes before an already aversive stimulus. So there's just that relation where you have the neutral stimulus coming before that aversive stimulus. The suggestion is that that neutral stimulus will become a CMOR, and termination of that warning stimulus will reinforce behavior and invoke responding that's been followed by its termination in the past. So let's take a look at this, because it's very similar to some of the avoidance behavior we talked about well, it's the same paradigm as the paradigms we talk about avoidance behavior in the past. So we have the neutral stimulus coming before, it's preceding at this point an aversive stimulus, so it's kind of a pattern of relations. That neutral stimulus is paired or becomes a CMOR, and behavior that's been, or termination of that CMOR will become a reinforcer. Therefore, behavior that's been followed by that termination in the past will be more likely to occur. And I stumbled a bit, so I want to kind of go through that again. The neutral stimulus repeatedly comes before the aversive stimulus. That neutral stimulus itself becomes a CMOR, in that it effectively establishes its own removal as an effective reinforcer, and therefore behavior that has been followed by that reinforcement will be more likely to occur. Look at this. This is the exact warning stimulus discriminated avoidance paradigm that we talked about last week. However, the suggestion here is it's actually a motivating operation, because if you notice, the reinforcer is not avoidance of that aversive stimulus, although it occurs typically. It is the removal of the CMOR, termination of the CMOR. So let's talk about an example. In a situation where the smell, all right, please forgive me, the picture does not match the scenario. So I'm just going to explain it without the picture. So in a situation where the smell of smoke or smoke repeatedly comes before the smoke alarm going off, right? And that smoke alarm going off has been considered aversive, right? That you'll engage in behavior that has been negatively reinforced by removal of that smoke alarm, or you'll engage in behavior or won't engage in behavior that's been followed by presentation of that smoke alarm. I just talked about a negative reinforcement contingency and a positive punishment contingency. So, smell of smoke repeatedly comes before that really aversive sound. But the CMOR then is suggested to become the smell of smoke, where the smell of smoke will then the removal of the smell of smoke, or the termination of smell of smoke itself, will become an effective reinforcer, and you'll engage in behavior that's been followed by the removal of the smell of smoke, for instance, turning a fan on. So, if we look at it, smell of smoke repeatedly comes before a smoke alarm going off, becomes a CMOR, in that it effectively establishes termination of smell of smoke as a reinforcer, and therefore turning the fan on is more likely to happen. Notice that there is an SD in this scenario, and what would evoke pushing a fan button but a fan button. In this situation, if you think about it, what's likely to also occur is that the smoke alarm will not go off. That's not included in this analysis, but it typically happens, and I'll let you know that there's been some that the analysis of the CMR has been a little controversial in the field, but this is one explanation for why such behavior occurs. Lastly, let's talk about the CMOT. The CMOT has also been covered in applied literature, especially with regard to manding behavior, which we'll talk about in the next module a little bit. Well, no, probably a lot. So when a previously neutral stimulus establishes a second stimulus as a reinforcer and evokes behavior that's been followed by that second stimulus in the past. And it's kind of like a chain, that the presence of one stimulus establishes another stimulus as a reinforcer and will therefore evoke those behaviors. So again, let's look at the paradigm a bit. So we have a situation where stimulus 1 establishes stimulus 2 as a reinforcer. So stimulus 2 would be an effective reinforcer in the presence of stimulus 1, and therefore evoke behaviors that have been followed by stimulus 2 in the past. It's important to note that stimulus 1 in this case is the CMOT, so therefore the presence of stimulus 1 would be what is combined with the SD to evoke the behavior. All right, so let's look at an example where you have what looks like a delicious bowl of soup but no spoon. That bowl of soup would evoke a spoon as an effective reinforcer, and you'd be more likely to engage in spoon finding behavior. Breaking it down to the wow, I just did not capture some of these things. I apologize. So we have a situation where soup with no spoon makes spoon an effective reinforcer, and therefore behaviors such as pulling a drawer or opening a silverware drawer in the presence of a silverware drawer would be more likely to occur. But make it a note that pulling on the drawer would not happen unless the soup with no spoon in the presence of the silverware drawer occurred. So our last check-in question: which of the following increases the value of its own termination as a reinforcer? CMOR, CMOT, CMOS, SD. And like we had just talked about a few minutes ago, I hope you came up with CMOR. That's the end of the lecture this week. The slides will also be posted on the website as usual, and I hope what this does is really breaks down the scientific events, the behavioral foundation for all of the things that we're going to read and talk about in the next few weeks. This stuff can be really complex and difficult, so I encourage you to go through it as many times as you need to, but also use the paradigms that I created to be able to input different variables into each of the paradigms. That's really the best way to start to be able to figure out each of these complex analyses, especially the conditional discriminations and the CMORs. As usual, email me with any questions. If you want to throw examples up on the Ask the Group, I'll make sure to check every day this week. And have a great week.